Open your Bibles to John 19, and we'll actually back up just a couple verses into John 18 because we left off there at verse 39 or so. John 19. So Jesus was on the way to the cross. I'm going to pick up the context because this just flows right from 18 into 19. So I kind of want to remind you where we were. And we just pick up this context and pick up this flow and flow right into chapter 19. Jesus was on the way to the cross whether Pilate knew it or not. We can go back to the beginning of the book of John and see that this was what John was on mission for the whole time. His message was Christ came to go to the cross, that he was always on the way to the cross for the purpose. He told Pilate, he said, "For this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth." And so he was always on the way to the cross. John was written somewhere, you look at the scholars, they range from anywhere like 80 A.D. to 117 A.D. It's because they did sort of lost track of John. There's no real indicators right in there, but by 125 they have some text, some of the original from like 125 AD going all the way back to almost right after he wrote it, like one of the first copies. Pretty fascinating. But John was writing this so much later after Jesus. And so you go, why does John's gospel look different? And if you look in history, what was going on at the time, there were already these heresies sort of rising up, and people were saying, there was even one of these sort of stories that said, well, Jesus didn't really go to the cross, that Simon the Cyrene picked up Jesus' cross, and they got confused and they crucified Simon. And Jesus wasn't, and that's as ridiculous as they get. It's not worth even mentioning, other than it just shows kind of what was going on. At the same time, there were people who were saying, well, Jesus wasn't really a man. He was God. And others were saying, well, he was a man, he wasn't really God. And then others saying, well, he just sort of looked like a man. He sort of was this sort of presentation, and people sort of saw him as that, but he wasn't really such thing. So as you go through this, you see John is very specific. He is presented as a man. He bleeds as a man. He is beaten as a man. He is a man, and he dies as a man, but he was always God, always in control, and always on the way to the cross. And so we pick that up, and with that in mind, you go into chapter 19 and keep those ideas in mind. Jesus said he came to bear witness to this truth, that he was a king with a kingdom, but it was not a kingdom of this world. And Pilate said, well, what is truth? Every time I study that passage, this idea of what is truth is, how can a man that is leading a group of people and is a leader and prominent in Rome at the time, even though it was godless, pagan, they had lots of gods, but they weren't really gods. How can this guy go, what is truth? How can he not have any concept of what his truth is? And you ask that, and you immediately come to our own context, and you go, man, that's so popular now. Everybody's like confused about what truth is. Where a woman going on the Supreme Court doesn't even know what a woman is. I mean, it's those kinds of things. It's like we have gotten so confused. What is truth? I went to the AI and asked AI, what is truth? Everybody's like, oh no, he didn't. I was really curious. So listen to this. Truth is a concept that has been debated by philosophers for centuries. It is generally defined as a quality of state of being. Truth can be thought of as a judgment, proposition, or an idea that is true or accepted as true. So you start getting little red flags, you read that. And then it says, in other words, it is a statement that corresponds with reality or fact. I'm like, bingo. Truth is also associated with fidelity to an original or to a standard. Well, that's what we want, right? Fidelity to that original. That original truth goes back to when God spoke creation into being and created us. That's the original truth, is Jesus Christ. So that fidelity to truth, I like that. It corresponds with reality. In fact, I like that. It all went downhill from there, though. From there, it began to tell about many theories and many thoughts about truth and how each idea of truth is a very noble cause, all researching and presenting this search of knowledge, understanding, and on it goes, which basically opens the door for anybody can have their own little idea of truth. And you almost knew it was coming from AI because they would never allow it to be offensive to anyone. So it's pretty watered down. Something for everybody in that answer. Proverbs tells us knowledge and understanding come from wisdom. Wisdom is truth, is fact. Truth isn't a thought. It's not a theory. It doesn't rely on our belief or our understanding. It doesn't rely on us in any way, shape, or form. Our understanding can't change the truth. We can all vote and decide on something. It doesn't change fact. It doesn't change the truth. If we're all gone tomorrow, the things that were true today will still be true tomorrow. Truth doesn't rely on us. We have truth when we have that original. We have truth when we have that original. It's based in the original in Jesus Christ. So we go on to back to the scriptures, setting this idea up. Pilate saying, what is truth? Jesus is standing before him. And we pick up in verse 39 as Pilate is been presented with Jesus by these Jewish officials. There's some indication that maybe this was a setup. But they're basically trying to get Pilate to punish him for calling himself a king, and trying to convince Pilate that he was a threat to Caesar, and so Pilate should get rid of him. And so Pilate says, but you have a custom that I should release someone to you at Passover. Therefore, do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Every time Pilate calls him king of the Jews, he's being sarcastic. He hated the Jews. Pilate hated Jews. He didn't want to get along. He didn't want to be there. He only tried to do his job well and keep the peace to impress Rome and get the heck out of Judah. He didn't like dealing with the Jews. He'd killed many of them. He did not want to get along, did not want to hear from them. And so every time he's calling the king of the Jews, he knew he was irritating that Jewish leadership. And it really is sarcasm. We don't know where this custom came from. There's no documentation of any custom. So it might have been some local custom swung by the Jews in putting pressure on Rome, the Roman officials, and maybe particularly just Pilate. And it may have been used to leverage, Pilate or Rome to let go of some Jewish political prisoners in some way, but probably never in a circumstance like we see here. They cried out in verse 40, then they cried again saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. Barabbas was, it says robber. The word actually means a murdering rebel, that he had was a threat to the government, that he was sort of viewed as an insurrectionist, but he was always rebelling in a murderous way and robbing and thieving at the same time. So Barabbas was headed to the cross. They wouldn't crucify a pickpocket. They wouldn't crucify somebody that stole the fruit from the market. They wouldn't crucify somebody for those things. They might flog the snot out of them, but they would not crucify them. And so whatever Barabbas was guilty of was very serious offense, and it probably involved this rebellious and murderous heart and attitude that he had. So Barabbas being free, they're crying for free this Barabbas, and Pilate has to be thinking, have they lost their mind? That they would take this man in which he found nothing wrong with Jesus. He found nothing against Rome that he should punish him in any way. Barabbas clearly deserved punishment. And yet they say, no, give us Barabbas. And it's this real sort of, the backdrop of this is this real Antichrist sort of mentality of we want somebody else instead of Christ. Antichrist always means instead of Jesus. Instead of Jesus, instead of giving us Jesus. It's very, and John uses irony over and over. That Pilate would present him as your king, you Jews. This is your king. Would you pass on your king? And they say, we don't want Jesus as our king. We want another. And so it's this very Antichrist that they choose another over Christ. Barabbas means a son of the Father. And so they were upset because Jesus had called himself the Son of God. They were upset because he called himself the Son of God and that he likened himself to God. And that's what really was behind the scenes that irritated them so much, that they saw him as a threat, a false Messiah, and they wanted him killed. And so here is Jesus. They're upset because he was the Son of God, and they're saying, free this other son of the Father. We want this son of the Father. Very clear and amazing picture of their rejection of Jesus, or rejection of the Messiah. Finally, we made it to chapter 19. Before you go on, I just want to, you got to think about a guy like Barabbas. What happened to Barabbas? He got up that morning, woke up that morning, clearly understanding it was the last day of his life, and that his life was full of wickedness, and whether he knew it or not, he was about to stand before his Maker. And he woke up that morning with a clear understanding where he was without hope. He was without hope. And in an indirect way, his hope came. He would have never in 1,000 years imagined he was going to stand up there before getting scourged and nailed to a cross. He would have never in 1,000 years thought that someone would come and step into his place. That this crowd would yell, give us Barabbas, free Barabbas. You had to be thinking, are you kidding? This is like a dream come true. And it's the same truth for every one of us. Because every one of us, as we come to Christ, would say, I'm nothing but a wicked sinner that if it was the last day of my life and I was getting crucified, that is better than what I deserve. That in the shadow of the throne of God, we would say, we would be on our face. That we would discover there's no good in us, not any good, nothing, not an inkling, not an ounce to where we could plead against the punishment. But in the midst of all that, suddenly someone steps forward and said, I'll take the punishment for that one. How incredible is that? And that's the picture that we see in Barabbas, and you wonder, what did Barabbas do with that? What did Barabbas do with that chance that it was given him? What have you done with the chance that's been given you? That's the bigger question here. What have you done with it? We can look at Barabbas, and we can look at all of these folks, and we can be very critical. We can pick apart the language and everything else. But in the end, this man was headed to a cross, and Jesus ended up on his cross. Jesus ended up on your cross. What are you going to do with that opportunity? Wow, I was kind of preachy. Verse 1. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and they put it on his head. And they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, Hail, King of the Jews. And they struck him. They struck him with their hands. And Pilate went out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him. And Pilate took and scourged him, probably beat him up, bloodied him up, and then present him to the crowd again to try to elicit some sympathy that they were asking for this man to be killed and he was innocent. Pilate was going to present him. He was like, I don't see anything wrong with this guy. And he felt like it was wrong. You know, you might say, well, Pilate had compassion. Pilate had no compassion. Pilate's response is strictly political. It's for his own interest, right? He is trying to maintain peace, keep this crowd at bay, deal with the issues at hand, but he was always for Pilate and for his politics. And so there's nothing in Pilate's life would you say, well, he had compassion on Jesus. He presents him as being innocent, doesn't understand why they would have want him crucified or punished in any way, takes him and scourges him. So there's much you can read about scourging. There's some say there was 2 kinds. Some say there's 3 kinds. Really what I see is a spectrum of scourging. On one end of the spectrum, they call a light scourging. A light scourge, nobody ever got scourged and walked away and went, wow, that was kind of a light one. It didn't happen. A light scourging was a brutal beating. And so they had different, these scourges, these flogs that they would use. They had them set up differently for different punishments. Probably was dependent on the rulers, dependent on the criminals and different things. For the most part, it was the straps of leather, multiple straps of leather. They had lead balls in them that were weighted them down, or some other weights. They had hooks, pieces of broken pottery, whatever, just sharp shards in them. And the other end of this, or this beating was, at the beginning was, of the spectrum was for criminals that would take a flogging and then be sent on the way with a warning. Don't ever let us come back. Don't ever be before this court again. And so that flogging was sufficient where that person left. They didn't ever think it was a light scourging. They would say, I ain't never going back to that. And that was the purpose of it. The other end of this was where more than one man even would have these, and you would be tied down and brutally beat to the point where your ribs were showing, your bones were visible. There's documented cases where the entrails were visible, organs were displayed, back was shredded, and the descriptions just get more and more gruesome. This scourging that John talked about, the language, the word he uses, sort of implies it was on sort of the lighter end of the scourging, if there is something called a lighter end. It was sufficient to bloody him up and present him back before this crowd with a crown of thorns twisted on his head. So somewhere in Pilate's investigation of talking to Jesus, he had mentioned that some of his actions were Galilee. He's from Galilee, and Pilate says, we could send him to Herod. That's Herod's problem. That's not my problem. He tried to wash his hands of it, send Jesus to Herod. So he went out to Herod. Jesus didn't say anything. Herod wanted to see a miracle, if you remember reading that. He's like, do a trick for me, Jesus. And Jesus did nothing. Herod gets frustrated. He smashes a crown on his head, dresses him in a purple robe, and sends him back to Pilate. It says from that day forward they were friends. What an awesome thing to be friends over. So Herod was if Pilate was bad, Herod was like, he was awful. And so this purple robe and crown of thorns is this mockery of a vassal king at that time, or a prince would be set up, that they would put a crown or a wreath on their head, and they would put a purple robe if they were a sort of a vassal prince, sort of a regional prince within Rome. And so this is completely mocking in mockery, but it's fascinating because the thorns always so symbolic, going back to the fall of man in the garden, where it said that his best efforts would always be to rule over the land would always be affected by the thorns and the thistles, which is sort of this picture of sin would always be present. Jesus is going across to take all of the sin of mankind, and so to be bearing this crown of thorns is sort of this picture of the weight of all of the sin of the world, that Jesus has taken that upon him. He's dressed in his purple robe. Some speculate it wouldn't throw anything of value. A purple robe is very valuable. It wouldn't have thrown anything valuable on it. Some suggest it's probably like a rug or something, an old worn out garment or something that was laying around that they throw around him to mock him. And they bring him out and hail him as King of the Jews. And again, just to poke and jab and anger the Jews, would they say these things. So once again, Pilate says, I find no fault in him. He brings him out, presents him, says, I find no fault. Verse 5. Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and a purple robe. Pilate said to them, behold the man. So here's John presenting Jesus as a man. He's bloody, he's beaten, and he has been declared even by Pilate at that time. So he's, again, I think John is writing this gospel for a purpose, for what is going on in the culture, that he be presented as God in the flesh, God the Son, but also he came as a man, and that he did die as a man. Behold the man. It's almost like Pilate saying, here's the man you're so afraid of. He's beaten and bloody, and he got a crown of thorns smashed on his head, wearing a purple robe. You really want to, it's almost like he's like, are you people lost? Have you lost your mind? He said, behold this man, and they, this almost looks like this demonic response. The chief priests and the officers saw, and they cried out saying, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, you take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. Again, it's sort of one more time that Pilate says, I don't find any fault. Verse 7, the Jews answered, said, we have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. So there's the truth behind all of these sort of false charges and everything that they brought to Pilate, that he called himself the Son of God. Therefore, in verse 8, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid. And he went again into the praetorium, and he said to Jesus, where are you from? And Jesus gave him no answer. So it's kind of, you go, why was Pilate suddenly, he was more afraid, which meant he was already afraid to some degree. Now he's even more afraid. What made him more afraid? And some speculate that, if you remember, Pilate's wife said, have nothing to do with this man. I had a dream about him, and you don't want anything to do with him. So he might have heard his wife's whisper in his ear. He might have heard that in his mind about this man declaring that he was the Son of God. The Son of God was also a title that was used to talk about Caesar. They considered the Caesars sons of God, and of course they had all kinds of gods. And so some think that maybe he heard something there that suddenly thought, oh no, I've been beaten on this guy, and what if he is some sort of son of God? But I don't think that holds any weight, because he's going to take him and beat him worse and crucify him. What was Pilate concerned about? What would bring fear to Pilate? There's only one thing I think that Pilate was concerned about. That was himself. Pilate was concerned about himself and the politics of the situation to support him. As if he was afraid of anything, he was afraid of an uprising within the Jews, and he was afraid that he was going to have to do this thing, and his name was going to be on it, and he did not want any part of this. He was backed in the corner. There was no-win situation politically, and Tiberius was interesting guy, and he was very paranoid. He was very suspicious of everybody. He was the Caesar Tiberius at the time. And so he was trying to get points to Tiberius, and he'd already been reported to Tiberius once for his failures as a governor. And so he goes back into the praetorium to speak to Jesus. Jesus says nothing. Verse 10, Pilate said to him, are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you? And he did. He had sole power to pull that trigger, so to speak. He didn't have to explain it or anything. He had the power to do this. But Jesus answered and said, you could have no power at all against me unless I had given it, it had been given from above. Which is, in essence is Jesus saying, you have no power unless I had given you that power. That power from above, if it is a power from God, he sets up kings and he takes them down. He sets up rulers and takes them away. And so Pilate is in that place because God allowed it. And Jesus is saying, has said all along, the Father and I are one. Now Jesus is standing there with a crown of thorns on his head, had been beat and mocked and spit on and punched because he gave them the authority to do that. That's pretty incredible. He said, therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. He's kind of letting Pilate off the hook a little bit. He said the Pilate was guilty and would stand for sin. In this situation, the greater one was the one that delivered him. So who are those that he was referring to? Well, this could be Judas at the outset. It could be Caiaphas from the Sanhedrin that would have come to this kangaroo court and found him guilty of these things and yelling blasphemy and tearing their clothes and all this drama, and delivers him up to Pilate. Could be sort of the Jews, the term John uses, the Jews, the Jewish leadership, Pharisees, the Sadducees, the chief priests, and so forth. And so it may be, and honestly, it may be all of those. They have this greater sin that they are responsible for, and it will be held responsible for. Verse 12, from then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. And so because they portrayed Jesus as this one that claimed that he was a king, that he was therefore a threat to Caesar. And Pilate, if you don't do anything, you're no friend of Caesar. We talked about this before a little bit. To be a friend of Caesar was to be in the inner circle, was to get the promotions, to get invited to Caesar's palace and have dinner with Caesar, to hang with the boss, and to get all the cushy deals and all of that stuff, right? That's really what made Pilate tick, man. That's what he wanted to be part of. And he's stuck in Judea, and he's already got a bad report card from to Tiberius. He didn't need these guys raising a ruckus and contacting Tiberius again and saying, hey, Pilate's he's failing to take care of business, and there's people that are a threat to you, Tiberius. Tiberius was already suspicious. Somebody put it out there that this guy was a threat to your throne, Tiberius, and Pilate did nothing about it. He had him right there. We kept saying, crucify him, and he never did it. Oh, they got Pilate boxed in tight now. He can't have this. He sees nothing wrong with this man. He's done nothing wrong, declared it at least 4 times, right? But remember what Pilate cares about. He cares about him and the politics of the situation. So he's painted into a corner. Verse 13, when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and he sat down in the judgment seat in the place that is called the pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, "Away with him, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. And they took Jesus and they led him away. This judgment seat was, remember, Pilate is at Herod's old palace. And that was sort of his Judean home. And within that, there was this area of pavement. It was sort of a slab of pavers, sort of a courtyard alongside the palace that he went out. And the important part was that was where the judgment seat was, the place where he would sit and issue judgments. All this other was preliminary investigation. When a judgment was given, he went and sat on the judgment seat, takes Jesus out after hearing this about Caesar, and sits on the judgment seat. And again, he said, "Shall I crucify your king?" John makes a point of telling us that it was Preparation Day. Preparation Day was the preparation for the Passover. Remember, this is Passover season, that thousands and thousands of extra people have come to Jerusalem all to celebrate the Passover. Preparation was the time when the lambs would be slaughtered. That's why John mentions this. This is Preparation Day, because John is pointing to Jesus, and he has already done this. He's going to continue to do this through the rest of this, is that he's pointing to Jesus as the Passover lamb. He is the true Passover. And so the priests are like concerned about the Passover and the celebration of Passover, but they're just determined to see Christ crucified. And so John mentions that it is Preparation Day, as they are killing their Passover lamb. They're in the process of killing the Passover lamb. He says it's about the 6th hour, which is a little bit confusing because as a Jew, the thing in John would have used sort of the Jewish method of time, saying time, which would be, they would begin at like 6 a.m. and then 6 hours would be noon. But Mark tells us that Jesus was crucified by 9 a.m. So they're thinking John is probably using the Roman method of time, where you actually start at midnight, and he's saying 6 a.m. So there's a little bit of lots of discussion, I guess, around that with sort of the scholars. They latch on to every little thing. And so either way, it's early. It's early in the day, and Pilate is saying, "Shall I crucify him?" And they're saying, "We have no king but Caesar." Which again, it's John's irony, that to say you have no king. You're right, you have no king. That you were passing on your Messiah that has come to you and presented himself to them. And they passed on him and chose another king. And they chose another son in Barabbas. They chose another king in Caesar. So then he was delivered. He's delivered, and this is essentially, Pilate has declared him his punishment to be crucifixion. But Pilate never really declared him being guilty of anything, and we know that Pilate washes his hands, is shown washing his hands in other places. Pilate wanted no part of it, but he had to crucify him to calm this crowd. Politically, he was boxed in to do this. To turn him over to be crucified was to turn him over to this group of Roman soldiers, is their specialty. And part of the crucifixion would be to go to be scourged. And so what I think John is presenting is that Jesus got this first scourging, and he was taken back. And the scourge before crucifixion was the one that was out here on the worst end of that spectrum, where they would beat you, and that beating ended up being merciful. It'd be merciful in the long run because it shortened the time on the cross, because it would be beaten so bad. And so these men would take Jesus, and they typically would take him and scourge them. And that they would then carry their cross, verse 17. And he, bearing his cross, went out to the place called the place of the skull, which is in Hebrew called in Hebrew Golgotha, verse 18, where they crucified him. And two others with him, one on either side, and Jesus at the center. And now Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. And the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Then when the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Therefore the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but he said, I am the King of the Jews. And Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. And so Jesus said, turned over to these guys. Normally that would include, before being crucified, this brutal scourging. All of this scourging and all of this is this commentaries just wear this out. But I believe what John is presenting is actually two scourgings. And so Jesus is then told he has to bear his cross. And so this is just the cross piece. Normally at that time that they would have to bring this and bear this wooden cross. And of course, John doesn't mention Simon of Cyrene, that on the way to where he was going to be crucified, Jesus became weak and he could no longer carry his cross. And this wasn't nothing abnormal, that the Roman soldiers would grab someone, and illegally they had to, do this, whatever these Roman soldiers. So they grabbed Simon, who was watching this, and he carries the cross for Christ. And you go, and it's one of these people. You go, that guy's life was changed forever when that soldier reached out and grabbed him and said, grab this cross and carry that for this man. And we see later that Simon had a son, Rufus, and he became very prominent in the early church. And it's just fascinating to see. John wasn't concerned with that. For John's purpose, remember, he is moving towards that cross and not to be impeded by anything. And so he's moving towards that picture of that cross, that this is a man, brutal and beaten, but he's also God in the flesh, and he's moving towards the cross. The early church fathers, they looked at this, Jesus carrying the cross, and to his sacrifice in obedience to the Father. And they likened it to Isaac carrying the wood of the sacrifice to the top of the mountain at the will of his father. If you remember the story, Abraham was to take Isaac to the top of the mountain at God's direction for sacrifice. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, he laid it on Isaac his son, and he took a fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and he said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. And that was on the same, every indication is that is in the exact same place. That all of this has taken place with Christ being taken to the cross and crucified. That this is the same mountain range and possibly even the same place that Isaac went up the sacrifice, and then the Lord stopped the hand of Abraham and provided the ram for the offering. Abraham had taken his only son and performed this sort of prophetic act that foreshadowed what would happen on that same hill a few thousand years later. Golgotha was just appears to be like a quarter mile away from where Pilate turned Jesus over to these men to take him out to this place to be crucified at the place of the skull. All the Gospels present the crucifixion without fanfare. They just say Jesus was crucified. They didn't give any details. Don't say any more. They didn't need to. Because at that time, the people they were writing to knew all about it. It was the kind of thing that made every people cringe. It wasn't spoken about in polite company. Everybody knew how gruesome and awful it was. And it was shameful, and to be crucified was a shameful thing. All the Gospels do speak of this without fanfare and offering this without any details. And they all mention that there were two others crucified, one on the right and one on the left of Christ, as a fulfillment of Psalm 23. These other men were these thought to be insurrectionists, rebels, murdering rebels, just like Barabbas. And it's very likely that these other two men were Barabbas' partners. And man, did they not think that it wasn't fair that Barabbas got off the hook, and here they were. And Jesus right between them. And we know one came to his senses. Both of those guys woke up that morning with the same thing, that my life is in and I'm without hope. And then one of them found hope in Christ. To the point where he's nailed to a cross, and he finds the joy of the Lord and says, by the end of this day, you will be in paradise. That day ended far better than he ever thought it would. How incredible is that? This crucifixion is the most significant event in human history, but at the time, it was just another day. It was just another day in Judea. You could look out on the Golgotha, and there would have been these poles that were set in the ground, about 10 feet high. These stakes permanently set in the ground with a notch near the top for the crossbeam to slip in. The condemned would lie down and carry this crossbeam out. They would lie down on it. Then they would be tied to it or nailed to it, that crossbeam. Then they would be hoisted up into place until that went into the notch, and then they would secure it into the notch with ropes. You can imagine being hoisted up by your arms hanging by nails, and then they bang this thing into that notch. And the pain and the just the idea of having been beat and your back raw and your bones hanging out, being on this rugged cross. They put a little shelf, I call it. They have names for all this, but it wouldn't mean anything to us. We would remember, but there's a little block on there to put their feet on. And so the block was used to push yourself up and relieve that pressure so that you could catch a breath. And the weakness, when your knees would buckle, you'd have to push up to catch a breath. And so they put this block. Now they might tie your feet or they might nail your feet, depending on the situation. In some cases, they put another block on the cross on the upright. And you could actually put your butt on it. It's like a little seat. And it sounds like merciful, like you could take a little seat and just rest for a minute. But there was no mercy on a cross. It was created for the maximum amount of pain and suffering. The whole thing, the crucifixion, is the word excruciating. It was to be excruciating long enough that everybody and as many people as possible could see. And the message is, don't mess with Rome. Don't break our laws. To sit on that seat, give you a little break, and all it did was give you a little bit of false hope. And it just dragged that process out farther and farther and farther. They said some of these guys lived for 9 days. 9 days on a cross. If nothing else happened. And so some of these criminals were left on the cross and they died when they died. They didn't take them down a lot of times. If they had, the Jews were treated different, but if they were just from other countries or whatever, they came and they were crucified, they were left out there, and they fed the wild animals until there was nothing left of them. So you can imagine what this area where they crucified people might look and smell like. completely off my notes. So crucifixion was invented by the Persians, perfected by the Romans. As I said, some of these would go up to 9 days. The message that they had for the cross would say, don't mess with Rome. The message that Jesus delivered from the cross was a message of love. God's message of love. That Jesus Christ went through this and suffered in the obedience to the Father because God so loved the world. God so loved you and I that he went through this and did this. That he might pay for our sins, that we might have everlasting life. While Jesus is nailed to the cross, hoisted into place, and beginning to his suffering on the cross, they're slaughtering the Passover lambs. John presents Jesus as that Passover lamb. There was a notice put on the cross. The notice was probably, as the cross was carried, there was always a sign about the charges that were brought against that person. And there might be a sign hung around the victim or the Roman soldier leading the procession to Golgotha. Might have that sign announcing to everybody what this criminal had done. And so as they arrived there, that sign would be attached to the cross above that victim so that charge would be available for everyone to see. And so the charge to Jesus was, Pilate's words, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, which was no charge at all. And it was Pilate's final word to these Jews about this situation, and he got the last word. It's his poke in the eye to them. And that angered him. They said, don't tell people it was the King of the Jews that you slaughtered, but that he said he was the King of the Jews. Pilate said, I said what I said. Live with it. But John presents again that irony. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Final poke by Pilate. So it was written in three languages. Hebrew was obviously the language of the Judeans, the Jews. Greek was the common language of commerce, and writing. Latin was the official language of the Roman Empire. And so this was an announcement that could be read by the world. It was for the world, because God so loved his son that he did that for the whole world. Let's go on to, where we at on time? Go a little farther. Verse 23. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and they made 4 parts, to each soldier a part, and also his tunic. And now the tunic was without seam, woven from the top in one piece. And they said, therefore, among themselves, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be, that the scripture might be fulfilled, which says, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Therefore the soldiers did these things. So the soldiers at crucifixion, they were just bored most of the time. And so they played all kinds of games for these gambling games. And one of the things when they crucified somebody, that possessions, they were crucified naked. They were stripped naked, and all their clothing, their sandals, the belt, and everything, the soldiers got those as part of their pay for doing that duty. And so they look at this tunic and see that this thing is very nice. This is a one-piece woven, and it's likened. So John's presenting that as sort of the attachment to the idea of the Levitical tunic of the priest, going all the way back to the priest, the high priest, that he would wear a tunic, a seamless tunic this way. And so he's sort of pointing towards this as an indication of Jesus is that indication Jesus is that high priest. Of course, these soldiers don't know. They don't know about any of this, but they're fulfilling prophecy in their response to this. So the other garment may have been seamed and sewn together and whatever, and so they may have divvied that up. Or you take this, you take his belt, I'll take his sandals. But man, let's gamble for this one. Let's not tear it up in 4 pieces. And so they gambled for that, fulfilling Psalm 22, verse 18. Now, there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, verse 26. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, that disciple took her to his own home. This is talking about John, that Jesus looked at John and put his mother in the care of John. And he was supposed to treat her like his own mother, and he did. And there's writings outside the Bible that talk about John took care of Mary until her dying day. And it looks like he took care of Mary for quite a few years from Jerusalem, and then after her passing is when John went to work in the church in around Ephesus in the area churches. Verse 28, after this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, "I thirst." And now a vessel full of sour wine was sitting there. And they filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on hyssop, and put it in his mouth. And so when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. And notice John makes the point of saying he gave up his spirit. Again, Jesus was there doing this by his own choice. He was never held to the cross by nails or ropes. In saying that he thirsted, he was they see us another fulfillment of Psalm 22, which is 22 verse 15. They see a fulfillment of that, this asking for a drink. The sour wine would have been a vinegar wine that the soldiers kept. It was a cheap wine. And this is, don't confuse this with the other mixture of myrrh that was offered to him and he passed on. That was a sort of a painkiller. And he said no, he wouldn't take this painkiller. That's presented in one of the other Gospels, that he would drink this cup fully and without the painkiller. And so this is just simply quenching his thirst. This is presented as just this vinegar wine was put on. Now, hyssop was not something you would drink wine from. And so everybody's like, this doesn't make sense. What they think is that the soldier would have had sort of, they would have had sponge. Every soldier would have had like a javelin, a spear, and that he probably put this sponge, soaked it, and puts it to Jesus' mouth. But John is presenting the Passover lamb, right? And what did they do at Passover? The blood of the Passover lamb was taken, a branch of hyssop, and the doorframe was painted with a branch of hyssop. And so John presents this action of the wine on this. He presents this as if it were hyssop and offered it to the Lord. And he begins that hyssop is pointing right back to Passover itself. And so Jesus then says, it is finished. We know from the other Gospels that he was mocked repeatedly by the officials, by people passing by. Mocked in terrible and ridiculous ways. And Jesus said, "It is finished." The word was tetelestai. They say this is a word that was used to mark documents, that loans that were paid in full. There's lots of different ways that this word is presented. But this is the sin debt has been paid and accomplished, that Christ, the work for which he came, had been accomplished in the flesh. So now all the work's not done, right? The story doesn't end here. Thank God that he overcomes death and he was raised again. But the work that he did in the flesh has now been completed, that he's been crucified, and that he gave up his spirit willingly for you and I. That's a good place to quit. There is no good place to quit in this. That you want to go through this whole thing together, but it's difficult because you want to dig into it too. Let me end with this. There's a novel. You don't know how old this is, but in one place it talks about a story that the Southern slaves had, and can't remember what I wanted to call it, but a story about the Southern slaves, and it was talked about the fourth temptation. Well, we know Jesus was tempted 3 times at the beginning of his ministry, and they present this story about the fourth temptation. And according to this legend, is while Jesus was on the cross and hanging there on the cross in this excruciating pain, that the devil returned. Remember, the devil said he would return at this opportune time. And the story is that the devil returned and whispered in his ear that they aren't worth it. That temptation was to die, but not die for the purpose that was intended. The devil supposedly whispered that they aren't worth it. It's then that the Lord said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That even Christ forgave those that nailed him to the cross, spit in his face, smashed a crown of thorns on his head, that mocked him endlessly. And even those soldiers that were gambling and playing, and they did this every day, had to know something was different. And of course, we know that when he dies, that the veil was torn in the temple, that it became dark, and suddenly all these indications that everything he claimed to be was real. John presents Jesus as fully man, fully God, and to a world that was trying to figure out whether to believe this or not. And so let's bow our heads.